The Anderson family, a beloved and adventurous group of five, set off on their annual holiday to the lush jungles of South America, sharing joyful photos along the way. But then, without warning, they vanished. No calls, no posts, no trace. For 5 years, the mystery consumed everyone who knew them, until one day, Sophie Anderson, the youngest daughter, reappeared alone, disheveled and carrying a story so shocking it would rewrite everything we thought we knew. The Anderson family was the kind of family everyone admired. Robert and Emily Anderson were both in their mid-40s, loving parents with a shared passion for exploring the world. Their 3 children, Lucas, 16, Mia, 12, and Sophie, 8, grew up surrounded by tales of their parents' travels, and every year the Andersons took a holiday trip to a new destination. In 2018, they planned an ambitious journey to South America to explore the pristine beauty of the Amazon rainforest. The family's excitement was evident in the weeks leading up to the trip. Social media posts showed snapshots of their preparations. Robert poring over maps, Emily packing supplies, and the children grinning as they tried on hiking boots. The Andersons intended to document their adventure with daily updates, wanting to share their experiences with friends and extended family back home. For the first few days of the trip, everything seemed to go as planned. They shared photos of vibrant plants, towering trees, and boat rides along winding rivers. Their captions were filled with wonder. "Nature like we've never seen before," one read, accompanied by a shot of Lucas standing beside a giant tree. Then, without warning, the updates stopped. At first, no one was alarmed. Spotty internet and cell service were expected in such a remote area. But as hours turned into days, concern began to mount. The Andersons had promised to check in daily, and their silence was out of character. By the end of the week, their extended family contacted authorities and reported them missing. The search for the Andersons began urgently. Local authorities organized search teams to comb the area where they were last seen. Helicopters scanned the dense rainforest from above, and boats navigated the rivers in hopes of finding their trail. The U.S. Embassy in Brazil became involved and coordinated with local officials to expand the efforts. Days became weeks, and hope dwindled with each passing moment. The jungle was vast and unyielding, seemingly swallowing every lead. The family's last known location was a small eco-lodge near the border of a protected area. Witnesses there recalled the Andersons leaving on a guided tour but did not recall their return. Even the guide, a seasoned local, was nowhere to be found. As months stretched into years, the search efforts eventually stopped. The rainforest's impenetrable nature and the lack of any solid leads left little for investigators to pursue. The calls for continued action were met with sympathetic but resigned responses. Authorities and locals alike agreed that the Anderson family had likely succumbed to the unforgiving jungle. Their disappearance joined the many unsolved mysteries of the Amazon. It was a routine morning at the American Embassy in Manaus, Brazil, 5 years after the Anderson family's disappearance, when an officer received a call from a local official. A young girl, disheveled and malnourished, had appeared at a remote outpost near the jungle. She was around 13, spoke halting English, and claimed her name was Sophie Anderson. The news stunned the embassy staff. Sophie Anderson, presumed dead along with her family for 5 years, was alive. Sophie was brought to the embassy. Her clothes were ragged, and her hair had been crudely cut. Embassy workers immediately confirmed her identity through old photos and records. Sophie, the youngest of the Anderson family, was the only one who had resurfaced. The questions surrounding her survival were overwhelming. Word of Sophie's reappearance spread quickly. It reached her extended family in the United States, and Francesca, her older cousin, and her grandfather, Mark Anderson, got the next flight to Brazil. When they arrived at the embassy, they barely recognized the girl who stood before them. Sophie was no longer the giggling 8-year-old they remembered. Her face was gaunt, her eyes were hollow, and her movements were cautious, as if she were bracing for something unseen. But when she saw her grandfather, her expression softened. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Grandpa," she whispered. She threw herself into his arms and clung tightly, as though afraid he might vanish too. Despite her halting speech, Sophie managed to convey glimpses of her ordeal. She mentioned strangers who had helped her and spoke of her family in vague terms, referring to them in the present tense. "They're still there, but sick," she said. "At one point, I came for help." Her words sent chills through Mark and Francesca. Could the rest of the Anderson family still be alive? If so, what condition were they in, and where had they been all these years? Sophie rested that night, but Mark and Francesca stayed up discussing what little they had learned. The fragments Sophie had shared painted a picture of survival against unimaginable odds, but the gaps in her shocking story left them with more questions than answers. The sun was barely rising when Sophie, Francesca, Mark, and their guide began their journey deep into the South American jungle. They set out from a small riverside village, accompanied by a local guide with a machete in hand. Sophie walked ahead of them, her steps assured, as if the dense, labyrinthine forest was an old friend. Francesca and Mark struggled to keep up. The thick humidity clung to their skin, but Sophie seemed unbothered. Her small frame moved effortlessly through the dense foliage, her feet finding invisible paths, as though she had traversed them countless times before. The deeper they went, the more they encountered signs of human struggle. Torn pieces of fabric dangled from low-hanging branches, and a rusted metal pot lay half buried in the underbrush. Francesca picked it up. This was theirs, she said quietly, glancing at Mark. They were here. Sophie didn't respond. She seemed intent on leading them somewhere, though she hadn't yet said where. As they pressed on, the forest grew darker. The canopy above thickened until sunlight barely pierced through. The air felt heavier, and the sounds of wildlife grew louder and more foreboding. By nightfall, they found a small clearing and set up camp. Mark tried to sleep, but his mind raced with questions. How had Sophie survived here for so long, and what had happened to the rest of the family? Francesca was equally restless. At one point, Sophie stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the clearing. Francesca followed. Sophie's gaze was fixed on the darkness beyond. We're close, she said. They're waiting. As the first light of dawn pierced through the canopy, Sophie led Francesca, Mark, and their guide deeper into the jungle. The dense foliage gave way to a narrow trail that twisted and turned. Then, without warning, she stopped and pointed ahead. There, she whispered. Francesca and Mark peered through the underbrush and saw a small village in a clearing. Simple huts made of woven leaves and wood stood in a circle around a communal fire pit. Smoke curled lazily into the sky. It was a place frozen in time, untouched by modern civilization. As they entered, villagers emerged from their huts. Sophie greeted them with gestures and words in an unfamiliar dialect. Her ease with the people astonished Francesca and Mark. The moment they saw the Anderson family, it was as if time stopped. Robert and Emily sat outside one of the huts. They were nearly unrecognizable, thin and their skin weathered. Lucas and Mia were nearby. Their conditions were similar, fragile and weakened. The sight brought tears to Mark's eyes. Emily, Robert, he called out. Robert looked up. His eyes widened in disbelief. Mark, he croaked. Francesca ran to embrace Mia and Lucas. The reunion was bittersweet. Joy mingled with the stark reality of their condition. Sophie stood nearby, watching silently as the family reconnected. As the initial shock subsided, Mark and Francesca began to take in their surroundings. The village was small and isolated. Its people lived off the land with remarkable ingenuity. They farmed modest plots of vegetables, fished in nearby streams, and foraged for medicinal herbs. Sophie explained in halting English that the villagers had found the Andersons lost and near death years ago and had taken them in, nursing them back to health. They saved us, Robert said. We wouldn't have survived without them. But it was clear that the family's health had deteriorated. Mark noticed Robert struggling to breathe and Emily coughing persistently. Lucas and Mia looked pale and lethargic. The villagers, too, showed signs of illness. They had sunken eyes, labored movements, and rashes on their skin. What's happening here? Francesca asked. Sophie explained that a mysterious sickness had spread through the village months ago. It affected everyone, including her family. The villagers had done their best to treat it with traditional remedies, but their isolation left them without access to modern medicine. That's why I left, Sophie said softly. I had to find help. Mark's heart sank. It was clear that the situation was dire. The family's survival depended on immediate medical aid, but the village's remote location posed a significant challenge. He and Francesca discussed their options with the Andersons and the village elders, who were reluctant to expose their community to outsiders. They're afraid, Emily said. They've lived here for generations, hidden from the world. They don't trust what they don't know. The discussion continued late into the evening, with Sophie acting as a bridge between the two worlds. Her fluency in the villagers' language and her deep connection to their customs earned their trust. Eventually, the elders agreed to allow limited outside assistance. That evening, as the fire crackled and the jungle sounds grew louder in the darkness, Sophie sat with Francesca and Mark near one of the huts. Her family rested inside, too weak to join them. Francesca gently encouraged Sophie to share her story. We got lost," Sophie said simply. "The guide took us on a new path, one he said was shorter, but something went wrong. A storm came, the rivers swelled, and the jungle closed in around us." The guide, Sophie explained, had panicked. He led the family deeper into the wilderness in an attempt to find shelter. Days turned into weeks as their food supplies dwindled and their spirits weakened. They lost track of time and direction. Their maps were rendered useless by the unrelenting landscape. "We were scared," Sophie said. "But Mom and Dad kept saying we'd find a way out." Then came the breaking point. One night, the guide vanished. Whether he abandoned them or succumbed to the jungle, Sophie never knew. Alone and desperate, the Anderson family pushed forward until they stumbled upon the village. "They found us," Sophie said. "The villagers. They didn't speak our language, but they helped. They gave us food, water, and shelter." At first, the Andersons had been wary and unsure of the tribe's intentions. But as time passed, they realized the villagers meant no harm. In fact, they had saved the family's lives. The Andersons had no choice but to adapt. They learned the tribe's ways of survival: fishing with nets woven from vines, foraging for edible plants, and using natural remedies to treat illnesses. "It wasn't easy," Sophie said. "Dad hurt his leg, Mom got sick from the water at first, but we learned we had to." Years passed. Sophie's once fluent English faded as she adopted the tribe's language. Lucas and Mia became adept at climbing trees and catching fish. Emily and Robert contributed to the community. They helped with farming and gathering firewood. Though they longed to return home, the Andersons grew to accept their new life. They believed rescue was impossible. Then the sickness came. Sophie described how the illness swept through the village. Fever, coughing, and fatigue claimed even the strongest members of the tribe. The Andersons, too, fell victim to the disease. Sophie's mother grew weak. Her energy faded with each passing day. Lucas and Mia struggled to stand, and Robert's breathing became labored. "I couldn't watch them get worse," Sophie said. "I knew I had to do something." Despite the villagers' protests, Sophie decided to leave and seek help. She prepared for weeks, gathering supplies and memorizing the faint trails that connected the village to the outside world. "I didn't know if I'd make it," she said, "but I couldn't stay and do nothing." As the firelight flickered in the village, Lucas stepped out of his tent and inched closer to Francesca and Mark. He glanced at Sophie, who gave him a subtle nod. He took a deep breath, then spoke in a hushed tone. "There's something Sophie didn't tell you," Lucas said. "The illness, it's not natural. It's caused by something in the water." Francesca and Mark exchanged worried glances. Lucas paused, collecting his thoughts. "While Sophie was looking for help, she found signs of mining upstream," he continued. "There were men, machines, and barrels of chemicals near the river. They've been dumping waste into the water we drink and use every day." Sophie reached into her bag and pulled out a small object, a rusted metal tag with an unfamiliar logo. "I found this near their site," she said. "The river feeds into the village. It's poisoning everyone, our family, the villagers, even the land." In the days following the shocking revelation, Francesca and Mark acted swiftly. With the trust of the village elders, they contacted local authorities and international aid organizations to bring immediate medical assistance to the remote jungle community. Doctors arrived by helicopter, bringing vaccines, clean water supplies, and medicines to combat the illnesses that had ravaged the village. Mark spearheaded efforts to alert environmental watchdog groups about the illegal mining operations Sophie had uncovered. Photos of the rusted metal tag and the polluted river were sent to global media outlets. The story, framed as a harrowing tale of survival, quickly gained international traction. Environmental activists, human rights organizations, and journalists descended upon the region to shine a light on the devastating impact of exploitation in remote, vulnerable communities. In the end, Sophie's bravery and the Anderson family's survival became more than just a story. They became a call to action, proving that even in the darkest moments, courage and determination could illuminate a path forward for everyone.